It almost reminds me to do an exercise that was a fundamental exercise as it relates to fake news, which was not mentioned during the session, which is the exercise in an audience like this to shout fire, and it turns out not to be fire, which turns out to be, from my point of view, the first element that showed that fake news is not constitutionally protected, because clearly shouting fire in a crowded exercise, which would stop everyone, as you can see, turns out not to be protected as free speech. And I think it might be useful to actually connect that with what was discussed as a whole debate about free speech as well. And by just introducing that, we got some attention. So welcome. My name is Stefaan Verhulst, and I'm here with Andrew Young, and we are both at the GovLab, and we are delighted to perhaps bring some more optimistic news after a fairly depressing yet very informative session. And what we will try to do is focus on what we see as a new emerging development with regard to sharing data and with regard to a new kind of corporate social responsibility as it relates to data in a time of big data. And so we have labeled this, others have labeled it others. We have labeled this data collaboratives. Some are labeling it data philanthropy. That was years ago. That was fake news, by the way. But anyway, and so, so what we will try to do is focus on that. Before we go there, perhaps, how does this work? A little 1-minute introduction about GovLab. So GovLab is an action research center based in New York at New York University. And the mission is really to focus on how can we improve people's lives by changing how we govern, especially using new technologies. And the belief and the premise that we try to test is whether technology has provided us with two new assets, two new supply sides, that as a result of those two new assets, we really can innovate how we go about solving public problems. And those two assets that GovLab focuses on and that we try to become smarter about, and especially try to provide evidence whether it actually makes a difference, are on the one hand data, surprise, surprise, and on the other hand people. And so the belief is that technology has enabled us to access those two supply sides that can actually address the demand side, the problems in society in new ways. And so in the data component of GovLab's work, we've done a lot of work in the past on open data, by which we mainly meant open government data. And so we've published several books about that. We have a website, OD Impact, and I think last year we also reflected on some of the findings of that. But through our work around open corporate data, open government data, we also started to realize that government data is only one supply side that has been unleashed, but that there is another supply side that is being collected, and you can have all kinds of arguments and discussions about whether that is done in an appropriate manner, but clearly there's another supply side there that quite often is untapped, and that's the supply side of data within corporate hands. And the question that we try to pose then is, how can you also unleash that supply side that is being held and is being collected by corporations in order to then address that to improve people's lives. And then in this context, in order to then drive new kinds of civic tech kind of solutions. And so what we've tried to do was understand what is happening. And then based upon that, try to understand whether there are some patterns, what are the opportunities, what are the value propositions as it relates to accessing corporate data, and what are the risks and what are the challenges as it relates to that. And so we started collecting examples of how corporations are sharing their data in order to improve people's lives, in order to change the way we govern, in order to fuel new kinds of research that could be publicly beneficial. And so we created this directory at the moment, which is called datacollaboratives.org, where we have identified 97 examples with regard to how corporations have shared the data. And so what we would like to do today is reflect on what we found and then give some examples on how we can turn that into then operational guidelines on how you go about accessing corporate data. And then we also will reflect on another tool that we have built, which is OGRX, which we have built together with mySociety and the World Bank, and also share some of the lessons learned there. But before we go deeper, perhaps, Andrew, you can reflect on some of the findings of some of the data in the data collaborative site.
Thanks, Stefaan. So the first example that we'll talk about in terms of the kind of data collaboratives model comes from Nepal and the crisis following the earthquakes there. So, at that point, obviously there was terrible devastation as a result of the earthquake, but the outcomes actually could have been a little bit worse, except that a telecom company there started to share its data with international organizations, with government institutions to kind of inform the relief efforts, to know where people are, to know how to target resources in an effective and evidence-based manner. So while obviously it was a terrible kind of disaster there, unlocking in a certain way some amount of corporate data actually helped to make things slightly less catastrophic than they could have been. So there's a number of other examples that we've collected on this site. As Stefaan said, 97. We have number 100 already lined up. Everything from Global Fishing Watch, so bringing together data to inform illegal fishing activities, whether it's related to human rights or overfishing of certain areas, to other examples of telecom data being unlocked to inform institutional decision-making around where people are and how to target resources, and many from the developing world, especially focused on things like health interventions around the Ebola response, for example. So on the datacollaboratives.org website, we have this directory where you can learn a little bit more about all of these different examples, what kind of data was being shared, what the intended impacts of the different projects are, and they're organized according to a number of different categories, from the type of data collaborative, sector, type of data being shared, and region. So in looking at this universe of 97 case studies, which of course is not a fully representative sample, it's just what we found in our kind of first year of really digging deep on what the current field of practice is, we've gotten some kind of interesting insight into where this new field of corporate data sharing for the public good is really active. So looking at the sectors in our universe here, the number one area right now where we're seeing a lot of activity is around infrastructure. So this is often around kind of urban planning. So examples like Waze sharing its information or Uber sharing its information to inform city planning around transportation decisions. Things like the environment, the Global Fishing Watch example, there's also a project called Global Forest Watch, which brings together data from across sectors to try to inform efforts to stop environmental degradation and deforestation. And then you also see examples, economic development, crisis response, like the Nepal example, all the way down to somewhat less prevalent sectors like criminal justice and telecommunications. So it's kind of encouraging, I think. Number one in terms of the regional distribution is North America, but number two is a worldwide focus. So many of these projects, the Global Forest Watch, for example, or Global Fishing Watch, they aren't focused on specifically one region. It's about bringing data together from all around the world to inform kind of interventions that can happen all around the world. But beyond that worldwide examples, we do see examples of data collaboratives kind of in place across all the other regions of the world as well.
Great. And with regard to the value proposition, so why would you and how is corporate data being used, we basically identified that from all the examples that we've gathered, that there are 5 big value propositions why you would want to have access to corporate data. And the first one is related with situational awareness and response, which is really about having access to corporate data can really make you smarter about the problem or about how society might work and how you ultimately can then do something about it. And so here We see a lot of examples, for instance, in crisis management, that really accessing telecom data, in the case of Nepal, Ncell, but we also have other cases where you have access to this kind of data, really provides you with a better environmental and situational insight than you otherwise might not have as it relates to specific situations. The second value proposition is really about then public service design and delivery, which could be also about urban design, of course. We see a lot of examples there where accessing transportation data, for instance, really allows cities to become smarter about how to design public transportation, for instance. The third example is really about then knowledge creation and transfer, which is really where those research collaboratives are being created with corporations, where you then ultimately, as a result of commingling different data sets, including corporate data or data that is being collected by corporations, you also have then an increased potential for identifying new insights. We see a lot of those examples in the medical, pharmaceutical, for instance, context. Then prediction and forecasting is really, of course, the real value proposition of big data, quite often where you then ultimately can actually start predicting and forecasting based upon some of the data that is being collected. Again, a lot of telecom data is being used for that to even predict where you would, for instance, combined with then public service design, where you can predict where you would actually put, for instance, a bus stop in the future, so that you actually have a better forecasting of how transportation should and is evolving. And then last but not least, of course, impact assessment with regard to certain kinds of interventions. So these are the 5 value propositions. And again, just emphasizing that this is obviously not a complete sample, but it's the most complete sample that we have so far. And so the question is, of course, how is that distribution then? And so we see, for instance, that the majority of the 97 cases that we have identified are really around knowledge creation, transfer, research consortiums that are being created around, quite often, corporate data, and then public service design, followed by situational awareness, and the others are the other reasons why accessing corporate data might be valuable from a public interest point of view. Andrew, you want to?
So it's also kind of worth mentioning that while we're looking at data collaboratives as a single field, there's a number of different types of sharing arrangements that are in place in this kind of universe of data collaboratives. And there's different shades of openness in terms of how the corporate data is being shared. So the first example we have here is around data cooperatives or pooling. So whenever different entities from across sectors all put their data together to inform kind of interventions from all parties involved. So one of my favorite examples there is a project called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, where 10 pharmaceutical companies all put some of their data into a pool that each of them could then pull from, but also the National Institutes of Health and the FDA could pull from that data as well. Which kind of speaks to some incentives issues that Stefan's going to talk about in a bit. We also see prizes and challenges, examples where corporations say, here's our data, who can find the most interesting or innovative public good use for that data. Research partnerships, examples of corporations working with universities or institutions to draw new public insights, public-focused insights from their data. Intelligence products, examples where corporations or industries pull together trends and larger scale demographic analyses that they draw from their data that can then inform the public sector in some of their work. APIs, of course, the kind of gold standard in a way of being able to tap into a corporation's data, things like the Twitter fire hose. And then trusted intermediaries, because it's understandable, and again, Stefan's going to talk about incentives in a moment, but corporations are not always going to be in a position where they're going to want to share all of their data with everyone or all of their data with many people. There are some examples where their data could be used toward a certain public good, but there needs to be some kind of trusted intermediary that can come in and access the data, analyze it in some way, and then draw insights from it that could then be kind of put into practice. We also see examples here of examples where the algorithm is brought to the data. So rather than a corporation actually sharing the data itself, someone might come with some analytical kind of algorithm to run on that data and then pull out the insights without the data actually ever moving across any sectors. So looking at the examples, the distribution across our examples, the data pooling piece is the one that seems to be most prevalent. And again, I think that probably speaks to some of the incentive issues of being able to access competitors' data and other public sector institutions' data, as well as sharing your own. We also see trusted intermediaries, also probably speaking to the issue of trust and how much do I want to release my data and potentially affect competitive advantage down through intelligence products and the others. I think it's a bit notable and maybe somewhat surprising that APIs were the least prevalent. The fact that the type of data collaborative that seems to have the least friction involved and would be easiest to tap into doesn't seem to be too much in use, at least at this point.
Great. And which also showed that this is obviously a fundamental different era than like a discussion about open government data, where basically you would have, hopefully the other way around, where you would want to have actually full access to open government data. Here you clearly see that this is a total different sphere of sharing, and that we really, and that's why we started this, we really have to become smarter about what are the different ways of actually tapping into corporate data. And now that we know that there are multiple variations, now we as a civic tech community, we can actually start thinking about what kinds of sharing agreements or what kind of sharing platforms do we want for what kind of purposes. And that's one of the purposes of doing this, this project. But when we talk about data sharing, most people, of course, are starting, on the one hand, they say, well, why would you want to have access to corporate data? But most people are saying, why would corporations share in the first place? And so what we try to understand is also what are actually some of the incentives for corporations to share the data or to at least enable others to make sense of some of this data. And we see what we call the 6 R's of 6 R's of motivations to share the data. And the first one is around reciprocity, which is linked again with the data pooling kind of exercise, where corporations share the data, but then they also know that they get something back. And so if they share data and they have access to other data sets, or they have access to expertise that they otherwise might not have, then you have some kind of a motivation or incentive for partnership. And we see many of those coming to fruition. Research and insights, clearly, we're not always talking about data sets that are collected by really data science-driven kind of corporations. Many corporations have data sets, but they don't have the data science capabilities. And quite often by sharing the data, they actually get insights from their own data that they can use for their own purposes, but also has clearly a public beneficial incentive. Reputation, obviously, many corporations might feel that if they start sharing the data, this is a way to actually strengthen and embrace a certain kind of reputation that might be beneficial. But important here is that it's not only reputation vis-a-vis their users, it's also reputation vis-a-vis potential employees. Because turns out a very important driver for engaging with public actors is to keep their data scientists happy. Because it turns out that many data scientists, quite often, when they join corporations, they are actually, anyway, interested in making sense of data, but it's only making sense about how to place advertisement, then that might frustrate some data scientists. And so by engaging with actually public agencies, it turns out that that is a critical strategy quite often for retaining or for having a reputation that also then attracts better data science quality. Revenue, clearly some corporations are also selling the data, and in some cases that might not be a bad thing. I just also finished a paper for OECD on the potential of corporate data for statistical agencies, and it turns out that if statistical agencies would buy corporate data, it would still be cheaper in some cases than if they would go for another full-blown population survey, for instance. And in some cases you do want to have that population survey, but in other cases you do want to have nowcasting, and then you do want to have access to, for instance, corporate data. Regulatory compliance is another reason why sometimes they share data, obviously. And then the last thing is the responsibility. I mean, I've written about this and others have written about this, that this is ultimately in a data age, a new kind of corporate social responsibility. And so you see some corporations really getting it and that they really see that this is the new kind of corporate social responsibility in a data age as such. Now, clearly, we don't have to be naive, and I see many already frowning and saying, I mean, accessing corporate data, and then, anyway, quite often, anyway, having partnerships with the devil and all those kinds of associations that some might come up with. Clearly, there are risks involved with regard to accessing and sharing data, and especially those risks, from my point of view, need to be considered from a broader perspective than just privacy, which is like always the discussion that we have about, oh, but there are privacy concerns as it relates to sharing data. Well, there are concerns and risks across the data value chain. And I think we really have, as a community, we really have to become smarter about, A, understanding both the benefits, but also the risks across the data value chain, and realizing that if you ignore one of those risks, it ultimately might haunt you. It might actually accelerate the risk further down the stage, because if you only focus, for instance, on the sharing risks that might be related with some kinds of expectations that are not met and some kinds of different cultures, then you might, for instance, ignore that the data was dirty in the first place, and then you start sharing dirty data, and then ultimately your analysis might ultimately be flawed. And so you do need to have an understanding about the risks across the value chain, and we need to then become smarter about mitigating those risks. And so one thing that we need to start doing is developing what I call data responsibility decision trees. Decision trees that enable civic tech organizations to work together with corporations around their data, but enables them to also pose questions at the different stages that then informs them about both the benefits and the risks, and that then informs a better way forward, and might even inform also not to do it in the first place quite often as well. So that's with regard to the benefits and the risks. What we do, and Andrew, you might want to reflect on that, what we do always with what we found is then turn that into methodologies. So now we basically, and again, these are findings that needs to be validated, findings that basically are premises from my point of view, and more research needs to be done. And to a large extent, those 97 examples is in itself an open data set. And so we give this open data set to the community, and anyone interested can actually now doing research or validating or adding to a large extent. But we have now certain premises that can inform practice. And so what we've done, and Andrew, you may want to reflect on that. What we've done is we turned what we found into a methodology, and we are actually now actively working with partners like UNICEF in implementing the methodology around building data collaboratives.
Yeah, so this is the designing a data collaborative methodology that we've developed, like Stefaan said, kind of based on this extensive look at the current field of practice, as well as kind of the burgeoning research going into this field. So it's essentially 8 different major phases, from identifying the demand all the way through iteration, with around 20 more detailed steps within them, from conducting a data audit, both of what information the institution has, to a wider kind of look at what kind of data could be useful that might be out there in the community, whether being held by corporations or NGOs or what have you, all the way through creating the kind of contracts and memoranda of understanding to inform what kind of sharing mechanism will be in place, what the governance structure might be, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you go through, this is available on our website. It's open for both use and kind of input from the field. For each of these 20 or so steps, we have a number of questions and considerations that one might ask themselves when kind of going through this process, as well as examples of how it might be done well, readings that might be useful, and also tools to kind of inform how you would do this. So like Stefaan said, we're currently kind of operationalizing this with UNICEF in particular, working with them to identify ways that corporate data might be able to help them address some of the problems that their missions are facing around the world. And we're kind of putting this into practice and seeing whether it works. So, and then did you want to touch on these, Stefaan?
So there are, of course, multiple questions and multiple priorities that remain to be answered. And as I said, we just started, but frankly, anyway, if anyone else has additional kind of insights, we would love to engage and compare some of the insights. But I think some of the questions that we really are gonna have to start addressing is what are the limitations of the supply, right? So clearly, and what are the opportunities? Clearly there is potential there, and clearly anyone who is a data scientist will say, well, what's the representativeness of the data in the first place, right? If you start using it for all kinds of purposes. But we really also have to become smart about both the limitations and the opportunities of the supply side, the data set in itself. We also have to then understand the demand side more, which is the same problem that the open data field has, right? If you build it, will they come? Well, if corporations start sharing the data, will anyone come, right? And will anyone actually be able to use the data? So what is the demand side, and what would be a healthy collaboration where you don't have this kind of distorted power relationships quite often between both demand and supply side? And what is then the impact? Frankly, as we need more evidence about the impact in civic tech in general, we also need really impact about if data is being shared, for instance, with regard to a crisis situation, what was the impact of then having this insight, and how can we then share that insight and share the impact in order to either get more or change the way you go about this. We need new models of collaboration. This is really at the forefront of what I call the new kinds of public-private partnership. We really need to think about how do you collaborate around data? How do you really start becoming a new data collaborative? And we need new models of data responsibility, including, frankly, new positions. I mean, I've been advocating, and we are working towards an event around this, but I've been advocating to really have positions like data stewards within corporations. I mean, anyone who has tried to have access to corporate data, and I don't know, anyone who has tried to engage with corporations around the data, good luck, right? In the sense that it's very hard to identify who you should talk to. It's very hard to then know whether that person can actually sign off on any kind of sharing of data. And it's very hard to then coordinate anyone within the corporation who feels that they have a say, whether it's the general counsel, or whether it's the data science department itself, or whether it is the commercial department who feels that sharing the data might be negatively effective to their own operations. It's very hard to do that. And so we need to professionalize, frankly, access to corporate data within corporations. And so we need data stewards, and we need new models of data responsibility. More can be found on datacollaboratives.org, but also can be found on OGRX, and that's the bridge with OGRX. So OGRX is the Open Governance Research Exchange, which is a platform that we've built together with World Bank and mySociety in order to really capture the insights that are out there. And one new service that we provide, and Rebecca has already contributed to that, one new service that we provide is like selected readings around a particular topic. And so one selected readings that we just launched is around data collaboratives, available at OGRX together with selected readings on civic tech, and we hope to engage many more. Andrew will tell a little bit more about OGRX and how it relates with this conference as well.
So it's actually happy birthday to OGRX. So we launched it last year in Barcelona at TICTeC, which is pretty exciting. So it's a platform that, as Stefaan said, we launched with mySociety and the World Bank, really aimed at kind of getting our arms around the field of civic tech and open governance research. Because as you know, I think we all know in this room, relevant work in this area spans disciplines, spans sectors, open versus closed. It's incredibly difficult to kind of get a grasp of what the signal and the noise of all of this new research is. So this is a curated platform that we work with our founding partners as well as some others. We have other partners here to really get a sense of what is the most what's the most important and influential and important research on fields from open data to civic technology to citizen engagement and behavioral science? How can we kind of create a more curated and useful kind of signal in that noise of these incredibly dispersed and expansive fields of research? So we're doing this with a number of partners, as you can see here. So everyone who works with us, we use OGRX as a platform for sharing their research, give them kind of dedicated pages where they can share their research, and we also try to give them a voice in the continued development of the platform. It's a year old, and we still have kind of big ideas for where we would like to take it. So if anyone is interested in joining this effort and partnering with us, whether as a contributing partner or any events that are coming up, we're more than happy to discuss opportunities there. So now that we've been out there for a year, we thought it would be useful to kind of take a look at what we have on the site. And we have currently 688 research papers, which shows research papers, reports, books, I should say, all manner of research publications on these different 21 or so fields that are relevant to governance, innovation, and civic tech, which is the idea that this is meant to be a curated platform, and we're already at that level of content, really kind of speaks to just how expansive and growing this field is. Over 1,400 authors are represented on the site across 35 sectors. 72 countries are the focus of pieces of research on the site, and you can see a breakdown of the different major central categories that we have there. An interesting point here is, for each of the publications that we put on the site, we make sure to tag them as open versus closed, because not everyone has the luxury of sitting at a research university with access to all of this work. I should preface this by saying that we count books that are for sale as a closed piece, so it's somewhat off. But nonetheless, of the 688 pieces on the site, 471 are not open access. In this field that is so driven by the idea of open access. I think that speaks to bigger issues around academic publishing and whatnot, but it's an interesting little finding, I think. So looking at what we have, I want to run through this quickly so we can take some questions. Looking at the sectors that are most prevalent in our repository of nearly 700 papers and books and reports, possibly no surprise, politics and governance, those are the kind of key focus areas for that work, as well as economics, health, and then human rights is also fairly prevalent on the site as well. Also worth noting, these won't add up to 688 because some of them are more focused on open data for open data's sake rather than open data in a particular sector, for example. Geographic breakdown, again, kind of examples where publications are specifically focused on a different region, not where the author is from. Pretty wide dispersal there, although it's abundantly clear that we need to identify an Australian or a New Zealand partner to help boost those numbers up a bit. But quite a lot from Europe and North America especially, but also some distribution around the world. So, the platform OGRX is very much meant to be, like I said, an opportunity to identify the signal and the noise, and we want to have some manner of curation with the field. But at the same time, we want to make sure that this is something that we're building together. So rather than just Stefaan and myself and Rebecca and Tiago kind of deciding what's useful, we're always looking for new contributions to the site. If you go on, it's ogrx.org. There's a submission page there. We're always looking for new work, whether it's your work or just things that you think are interesting that we should have there. And you can also use the OGRX hashtag to make any suggestions there, and we'll get it up on the site.
Yeah, and to a large extent, again, this is meant to be like a platform and infrastructure, but we also realize that a repository in itself can be useful, and that's why we build it, but there are other potential uses once you have a repository. And so what we really would like to, and we are developing new strategies in order to create added value products, right? So one is like the selected reading list, but what we really would like to hear from you is what kind of products would your knowledge products coming from like now we have 700 papers. What would you like to see beyond a list of 700 papers, right? Which is of course valuable in its own right, but what added value can we create now that we have this kind of universe of knowledge? Is it selected readings? Would summary of findings be useful? Would the top 10 insights that then can be fact-checked to a large extent, would the top 10 insights from the field, would that be useful? So what are the added value products that you would like to see? And so eager to hear for the remainder of this conference, but also via other means on what you believe would be useful moving forward as well. So with that, we probably went over time, Mark. Datacollaboratives.org, OGRX.org, and of course, we still have the digest as well, talking about curation. So anyone interested in a weekly update on what happens, feel free to also subscribe to that as well. Thank you very much.
I think it's so great that you're showing what is in a closed journal and what is in an open journal, and you guys should add like some sort of emoji, sad face, happy face would be fantastic. One thought is not just, I think offering insights from all these papers that have been published would be wonderful to so many people. And then also if you're able to facilitate any sort of way so that practitioners and policymakers are able to signal what type of further research and research questions would be most applicable to inform their future work, I think that would make this type of research especially relevant and practical.
Thanks for putting together the previous website on like how to collaborate with corporations. So as somebody I used to work for the World Resources Institute that set up Global Forest Watch, which I wouldn't classify as corporate data, just to be clear. And so I was just wondering, like from an environmental background, like of course we know corporations have the best data, and it's always the question of how to get that data. And so I was wondering, like, is there a space for groups to actually reflect when the collaborations didn't work? So for example, we had been trying to work with the leading beverage companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi because they have the best data on fresh water quality and quantity around the world. So we're trying to create an anonymized data set, and like we were working with folks from Yale and WRI and like had the elite crew to set up a legit structure, and it didn't work out because they didn't, because of secrets and things like that. And so I was just wondering, is there a place where we could like share that in a positive way so people can learn about like when those collaborations didn't work out, and so like how we might improve it for next time?
Let's create it. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, this field is at just beginning. I mean, there's a lot of experimentation, but really taking this to the professional level, learning from what does not work, developing sharing agreements so that in the future it might work, getting these data stewards in place, having a data responsibility framework, a decision tree, getting more value propositions about what did work. I mean, there is, anyway, plenty of work to be done, and we'd be delighted to work together. I mean, we will develop those kinds of events moving forward, like an event around data stewards or an event about what, anyway, failed data collaboratives, or anyway, we could use a different term, although failure is apparently in these days. But yes, let's work together, and there's plenty of stuff to be happening in that space to become smarter, and actually to then tap into this asset, which is why we started, an asset that is quite often untapped, and if tapped, all our lives who care about civic tech might actually be better.
Just another shameless plug. MAVC is...
Thank you very much. No.
We've published about 67 research publications over the last 2 years. We've got another 60 or 70 publications coming out before November. They're all open licensed. They all come with clear, brief summaries of the main findings from them. So please kind of take them, use them, put them in your system as well. Great. Bye.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. That'll up our open versus closed ratio, which will be nice.
So on data collaboratives, you're in a room full of people that love open government data, like totally open, not shades of open. Yeah. Have you seen any of your cases where doing a semi-open partnership was a gateway drug to then making the data fully open?
I'm gonna have to go through the data to be, anyway, I don't want to create fake news here, but but what we do see is, first of all, it's a hard sell within corporations. And so, but once they get and see that there was positive reactions and that actually they made a difference, then you see more potential there. And so whether this will ever lead to full access and free access in the manner that you would expect from open government data, that's probably a tough sell in addition to even just opening it up widely. But you do see that more experience leads to more experimentation, more broader kind of awareness within the corporation that the data can actually have an impact, and as a result can also be used. Like for instance, Ncell, I mean, telecom operations are getting it more and more because A, they're using it, or their competitors are doing it. And so, and then it becomes like a competitive edge to actually also saying, well, yeah, but we share also, right? And so that's what you see happening at the moment.
That's great. Stefaan, Andrew, thanks very much.